Hello there. Time can be a fickle mistress, especially if you try to mess with her in her black hole. Time is not to be taken lightly. As we know, within the Federation and Starfleet, there are discovered means of actually traveling through time. These vary from things like time warp to various forms of temporal displacement, alien interference, wormholes, you name it. There are actually a myriad of different ways that time displacement can be achieved, either on purpose, like said, through time warp or through the Guardian of Forever, or by accident, via a wormhole or some other means. But however it is accomplished, there can be what would be called the butterfly effect. And for those of you who are not familiar with the term, the concept of this is a person goes back in time and shoots their own grandfather. Now you have a problem. You don't exist anymore. You're dead because your mother was never born, or she wasn't raised quite the same. You go further back in time and you step on a butterfly 50 million years ago. The result is the entire human race doesn't exist, because the knock-on effect of that one butterfly not entering into the food chain and all of its descendants not being in the food chain could potentially have dire effects. Now, as a result of this, civilizations that reached a certain level of higher levels of technology found ways to regulate such events, to try to prevent them in the first place from happening, or if they do happen, to try to minimize it or even correct it. And we're going to discuss some of the ones that humanity has been somewhat involved in today, and this is part of a new series that will be covering such aspects within the Federation and the greater universe therein. Before we get started, however, like, share and subscribe, comment down below, and let's get started on this one, which is we're going to cover the main agencies we know about that the Federation has at its disposal to attempt to regulate distortions in the timeline. The first one we encounter is in the 24th century. We can assume this agency, the Department of Temporal Investigations, probably is much older, maybe dating back to the days of Kirk, as they reference him as being something of a menace to time, because there were multiple infractions and events throughout time. Now, as they were recording these, we can only assume that every time Kirk time warped, went back in time and allowed someone to be hit by a car or whatever, there was actually some kind of ripple effect, and someone had to look into that. But the powers of the Department of Temporal Investigations was somewhat construed. Although they could investigate such ripples, to our knowledge, there's no evidence that they actually had any means to do anything about it. It's not clear whether or not something like time warp would ever be authorized to try to correct an error in the timeline. Perhaps more identify it and try to prevent future corruptions was more likely. Realistically, it was just an investigation to see what the hell had happened and if someone needed to be blamed for it. Later, however, we do see another agency known as the Temporal Integrity Commission, the TIC. It's not entirely clear whether the TIC is actually a division of Starfleet or a totally separate agency, because bear in mind, the Federation is big, and as I discussed previously, there are actually many different facets to the Federation. The Earth Cargo Authority, Starfleet, the various different navies of the different races all make up components of the Federation. Section 31 is a prime example of an agency that, although technically splinters away from Starfleet as a part of the Starfleet Charter, it is strictly speaking a separate agency within the Federation, making it a Federation agency the same way Starfleet is, but not actually part of Starfleet, to make that clear. So the TIC could potentially fit into that subcategory of being a Federation agency, either associated with Starfleet or completely separate, standing alone from it. Although I am going to do more episodes on the TIC, particularly on the Wells class and on some of its members. In brief, they actually are from the 29th century. Their exact year of founding is again unknown, probably highly classified. Their ship is equipped with temporal shields that we see. They have the ability to the vessel itself travel through time, but mostly they prefer to minimize their footprint by using temporal transporters to beam through time. and their job, using their temporal scanners that they admit, interestingly, as a side note, are not as advanced as 24th century Borg temporal scanners. So, that just shows how much more advanced the Borg really are than the Federation. These organization's purpose is to not only detect changes in the timeline, but actively go back and try to correct them. We see them do something similar when they take 7 of 9 out of her timeline and keep sending her around to try to fix alterations in the time. We also see them later in the 23rd century or earlier. It could even be chronologically both, actually, technically speaking. That TIC might have been earlier than the TIC operatives we encountered in Voyager from the 24th century. They could be like a 28th century. We don't know. Wibbly wobbly timey wimey. It's hard to get a handle on it. We do know they have a thing called reintegration, where they integrate people. If a person starts to sort of have multiple timelines, they can pull them all back and reintegrate them into a single entity and fix the problem there. Their job is to minimize the impact of disruption to the timeline. Later, probably not much later, but certainly by the 31st century, there are the temporal accords. These we encounter an agent, a human, known as Daniels. Now, the temporal accords are actually not a specific body. They're more like a representative group and an alliance and a treaty between the different races that have the ability to control time travel on some level. And they all kind of come together and agree that time travel is bad and there are too many negative side effects to its use for everyone to be openly just using it to try and improve themselves. Now, we do know that this agency was heavily involved in the Temporal Cold War. Why the TIC was not is a little vague, but it's likely, as the Temporal Accords are not a Federation agency, we know they are not, their members are not part of Starfleet. It's likely the Temporal Accords is a treaty which is made up of many races which are likely external to as well as inside of the Federation. This agency was involved as a sort of faction within the Temporal Cold War in and of itself, which again we will cover in more detail, but their faction was trying to actually prevent changes in the timeline, not utilize them to benefit itself and improve themselves like some of the others were. Their main goal was to stabilize the timeline and stop people interfering with it, and that was the main goal of the organization. They don't interfere likely in things that the TIC had already dealt with, because from their point of view those were kind of already done, what you might call a predestination paradox. When it comes to time travel, it all gets very confusing because you start to look at divergent timelines like the so-called Kelvin universe, which we do know has been encountered by people from this era. We also can potentially see the Terran Empire, the Confederacy of Earth, and other divergent timelines occasionally being created. So, butterfly effect again. There it is, pure and simple. Now, although I'm not going to get massively into these other agencies because I'm going to cover the Temporal Cold War as its own thing, I will briefly cover some of the groups and organizations and individuals we do see actually utilizing time travel and why an agency like the TIC or the Temporal Accords would be necessary. Because the Temporal Accords, again, remember, although they don't seem to be a specific agency, they do have agents, which I always infer that they are collective from different races, and probably the TIC is actually just one representative body of the Federation in the Temporal Accords rather than running it. It's hard to say exactly because we don't know much about its internal mechanics. However, that's a reasonable conclusion because we do know that Daniels was based on Earth, and the Federation was heavily involved with protecting the timeline with the so-called Temporal Prime Directive. This likely existed by the 24th and 25th, certainly by the 25th century, but was rigorously enforced by the TIC and then later the Temporal Accords. We see a few individuals and races actually utilizing time travel to their own gain, where we can see an agency like the TIC would have to step in. One was Rasmussen, a 22nd century human scientist who actually came across a 26th century time ship, whether it was a Federation one or not, a little vague, but I think it was, and was using it to travel through time and steal technology from the future to go back to his own time to then invent. Quite smart, but very dangerous. Another was a faction that I personally suspect are actually part of the Temporal Cold War. We encountered them in the 24th century. They're again from some distant future, and we encountered them on Risa. And these aliens were traveling back and trying to basically get an artifact. It's a whole thing, but basically they were screwing with time again, and they were utilizing a temporal transporter to go back in time, and we see them at this time period. And other than them, we also see a transdimensional race of aliens that were traveling back from the 24th century on an alien planet to the 19th century on Earth, and they were basically sucking people's souls dry. That's not exactly accurate, but it's basically what they were doing. They were feeding on the people that they were encountering, and as a result affecting the timeline once again. And it took the crew of the Enterprise to go back and stop them, which I assume again was the consideration of a predestination paradox, which is why an organization like the TIC wouldn't intervene. It also might be considered a natural thing, as this race just seemingly did that. It may have just been the way things were. I would imagine there's certain disruptions to the timeline that, as long as they're only minor, they get kind of ignored. And then the worst and most egregious one we know of were the Krenim, with the temporal weapon ship. Exactly why the TIC didn't intervene here is probably a conversation for a video of its own, but it's an interesting idea. This was probably the most destructive weapon ever encountered by the Federation. The ability to entirely erase an entire species from existence with one shot was destructive on a mind-boggling scale. But these are all examples of people misusing time travel that we have seen, and those are just the ones we know about. There are likely many others, and explains why such an agency will be necessary. The Temporal Cold War is probably a close second to the Krenim temporal weapon ship for people screwing up the timeline. We don't know how much damage and destruction these people have done, and they're still at it, as we see with the recent events that have affected Khan Noonien Singh and later La'an Singh. It's certainly affecting events at least as far forward as the 23rd century, and we have still yet to really see the repercussions of these interventions. Another group, I should note, but these are more benevolent, were the Travelers. It's not clear if they're members of the Temporal Accords. They seem to travel in both space and time freely, and they also have operatives we know, such as Gary 7, who go back in time, and they kind of protect worlds and people and things like that. And they too correct the timelines. Likely, in my opinion, they may be members of the Temporal Accord, but you let me know in the comments below what you think. Whether the Travelers are just their own group, because they're certainly not a race. They are. And they may or may not be involved. Personally, it would make sense to me that they would be. Otherwise, they might actually run into problems with other temporal agents. But it's hard to really say. But what do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. And before we go, one more quick spot for Alternative World. This, in case you haven't realized from me mentioning it in other videos, is a company me and my wife have recently started. It's an alternative fashion clothing line which it's kind of bespoke. It's designed by us, my wife and an artist, that have designed various t-shirts. There are hoodies and other items coming, as well as a number of branded items on our website currently. The link is in the description below, but it is alternativeworld.co.uk. We can only currently deliver to the United Kingdom, and the stock on there is limited at the moment. Although if anything does sell out, it is stuff we're going to replenish. We will get more, but there is a limited range at the moment. But over the coming months it will expand, and there will be a lot more stuff on there, so please check it out. If there's anything you like, feel free, have a look. We have got some good stuff coming soon. There's a couple of new things at least start coming in this month, and I know that I have a range of stuff planned that I will eventually show that is for Halloween, various horror themed things which I have designed. It's all down in the link below on our website, alternativeworld.co.uk. This is not, I should point out, just a YouTube attached website. I'm not trying to push merchandise for this or Star Trek or anything like that. As you can tell, I'm not exactly the most vanilla normal person you'll ever meet, and everything we have is kind of stuff I would like. Other people that I know who are mostly amongst the alternative community and LGBTQ, and it's stuff we like, and the feedback I've had so far has been very good, and we do try to focus on quality, so it's not just printed at home simple stuff you might find on eBay or Etsy. It's actually professionally made, high quality, and printed using supplementary printing styles, as well as I said, we have various branded things on there. But that's enough about that. Check it out if you like. If not, or if you didn't bother watching all we're doing in this video, I thank you for watching to whatever point you did. Not that you would have heard that. And again, like, share, subscribe, and bye-bye. I'd just like to say a thank you to everyone for watching that video. I hope you enjoyed it. I really enjoy making these. If you did enjoy it, please consider giving a like, share, and a subscribe, and maybe checking out the other videos on the screen right now. And in the description box below, there are links to my other social media accounts.